Hi everyone, and welcome to DevOps Transformations with Helen Beale at Ranger 4. Just to let you know, my name's Tijal Patel, and I actually head up our DevOps and Cloud division here at eSynergy. So just to give you a very brief insight into eSynergy, we actually specialise in the open source and cloud market. So if any of you are hiring at the moment or looking for a new opportunity, please do let us know after the call. Um, Now, just in for some kind of brief housekeeping rules, if you do have any questions throughout the talk, please fire them up over via the question box and Helen will answer those after the end of the talk. Also, just for your information, we will be recording the webinar. So hopefully by the latest tomorrow morning, we'll have the slide deck for everyone. And finally, if you would like to follow up with either myself or Helen, we'll make sure we send out both of our contact details so you can follow up after the event. That's it from me. I will now pass you over to Helen Beale. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tejal. So good afternoon to all of you in the UK and Europe. I think there's people from the States on today, so good morning to you. As Tejal said, my name is Helen Beale and I am at Ranger 4 with DevOps Transformation Consultants and Specialists. And today I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking to you about DevOps transformations and structuring approaches to change. So first of all, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about what's different about DevOps. And this is where we used to start talking to people about definitions of DevOps, and we talk about various different elements of DevOps and CANs and culture and automation and metrics and sharing. And I'd often talk about Jesse Robinson, who used to talk about don't fight stupid, make more awesome, and lots of ways that people have looked at DevOps. And what we've really found, and if you look on our blog, you'll see we do an initiative every week called DevOps Friday 5. What we found is that DevOps tends to mean something different to most people. It's quite it is fundamentally a methodology, but there are quite a lot of different ways of looking at it. So what we've found more valuable these days is actually to have a conversation with people about what makes DevOps different and primarily why it carries the currency that it carries in the marketplace today. So if you look at any kind of Google Analytics over the occurrence of DevOps in job roles descriptions over the last 2 or 3 years, you'll see there's some massive upticks, kind of hockey stick graph showing that. And certainly we've noticed huge popularity around any kind of content, whether it be webcasts or anything written or events that we're doing around DevOps. So a lot of people want to talk about it. And the reasons we think people want to talk about DevOps are threefold. And what makes DevOps different from what people have been talking about before, because if we ultimately try and describe what DevOps is trying to do, what it's trying to do is get innovation to market faster, so more, better code to end users quicker than ever before. But really that's something that IT departments have been trying to do for some time. So what's different about it now, and why is DevOps getting so much attention? So first of all, the market is in a state at the moment that it never has been before. So the internet may be sort of 20 years old, but in terms of the way that the internet is impacting businesses today is quite different. The importance to businesses of the internet and digital transformation and the ability to digitize a business is absolutely key to success. So many businesses are feeling the pinch or have gone under because they've been superseded by internet-based businesses. We talk to some of our customers, for example, in the insurance industry, who feel that their traditional business is at risk because businesses such as our classic retailers, our supermarkets, are offering more and more insurance type contracts to their customers because they're able to do that now because customers are generally buying things like insurance online and not necessarily from the Swintons or the brokerage shops that we used to go to on the high street. So it's an incredibly competitive marketplace, and IT is more strategic than it ever has been before. So what we have are groups of developers in organisations that are under a lot of pressure from their business to deliver innovation to their end users. And at the same time, we have groups of IT operations people who have the responsibility for very complex infrastructures that evolved over time. They've lived through the last few decades, they've lived through change like SOA, and they've started to build very complex, heterogeneous environments. They've probably got multiple web platforms, Java, they've probably got .NET as well. They may have different flavors of Java. They'll probably have some ESBs or some brokers in there, and lots of call outs to third-party services and integrations within their own systems. And as a consequence, then, these systems are actually quite fragile. So the IT operations people are quite risk averse, and they often see this innovation coming through from development, or this change being pushed by the business, as a risk to the stability of the system, which often they're rewarded on things like uptime. So they're very much motivated to control and keep those things in production and live, and not allow for any outages. The other thing that's happened over the past few decades is, as IT departments have grown up and have grown, the classic way of organising an IT department is to have development on one side and operations on the other. And I've been to many customer sites where I've either walked into a building where there's been a hallway and development have been on one side and operations have been on the other, or development have been on one floor and operations have been on another separate floor. So there's a lot of barriers or physical separation between these two parts of the organisation. And those physical barriers are often actually sort of communication and collaborative barriers as well. So they operate quite separately. If you look at an organisational chart, you'll see development reporting into a development director, ops reporting into an operations director, and then those two directors are likely to report into an overall IT director. So in summary, that's kind of the first thing that's different about DevOps, is it's got such currency in the way we speak today because of what we've developed over the past few years in terms of the way that our IT departments are constructed and the infrastructures that we've developed, and now on top of this, the competitive importance of getting our digitisation right and getting the business able to flow innovation through to the end users. And that conflict between development and operations manifests itself in a number of different ways. So we hear things like, it takes operations too long to spin me up an environment. We hear things like the development are asking for access to a production environment that we really shouldn't give them access to. We hear things like, we had an outage and first thing we knew was that a customer rang and we didn't know what caused it, and we pulled together a war room. We hear things like, we have to schedule release weekends so that everyone comes in over the weekend and we all work 24 hours to make sure that that release gets out the door and fix all the things that go wrong with it. So there's lots of ways in which that those two differing pressures result in some stress between those two organisations. The second part that I think makes DevOps really different and why it's important today is really to do with a couple of other things that have happened over the last decade or so. And one is Agile and one is ITIL. And on the face of it, lots of people think those are two, again, conflicting things, and they think that DevOps and ITIL could never be together. They're two different things, because Agile is all about moving away from a waterfall development process where we spend a long time designing and then a long time developing and then a long time testing and finally go through a long release cycle. And it can take months, if not years, for an IT software project to get into production using Waterfall. Agile is all about taking an iterative approach, breaking those requirements down into individual features and delivering at speed. And DevOps really is like an extension of Agile. So where Agile was helping developers think and deliver iteratively, DevOps is extending that methodology into operations and helping operation teams support development and run their environments in the lowest risk way possible, but getting these features out fast to the end users that need and want them. And I think it's important to understand that DevOps isn't anti-ITIL by any means. They have lots of similarities, and there's lots of ways in which DevOps supports ITIL. DevOps, and we'll go into this in a bit more detail, is all about involving operations earlier on in the life cycle. So those things that are really important to the operations people, the things that they can hang their hat on and say, this will de-risk that thing happening in my production environment. All of those controls should be put into the process earlier. And the DevOps tooling and automation part gives us lots of opportunities to give IT operations and people that are concerned around ITIL and ITSM lots of confidence that what we're trying to do when we're doing things at speed are controlled, they are templated, we can have confidence in that they're predictable, the results are consistent. And thirdly, and finally, I think the other thing that makes DevOps quite different is around really just hang on a second. apologies. As I was saying, the third part was we're just touching on this really, the technologies that make life different around DevOps. So over the last sort of 4 or 5 years, and it was about 5 years ago that DevOps was coined as a term on Twitter by Patrick Dubois, a Belgian person that was doing some work at DevOps Days and Velocity, and identified that there was this need for development and operations people to work much closer together. It was Patrick and these tools, so things like Puppet and Chef, that were starting to come through that really made it easier for IT operations and development staff to work much closer together. So we've seen a number of tools come through. I've just mentioned a couple which are really around orchestration. Other ones that you're probably familiar with are things like Jenkins, so for build, things around application release automation, also lots of things around application performance management. But we'll go into all of these tools in a little bit more detail as we go through the next stage here. So those of you that are familiar with DevOps or you've looked at it before, you'll probably know that a big part of DevOps is around culture and not necessarily tools. So we're going to talk a bit about tools today, but I want to drive that discussion around talking about some high-level goals. So first of all, we're going to talk about releasing on demand. Then we're going to talk a little bit about technical debt and unplanned work. And I'm hoping that a few people on the call today have read things like The Phoenix Project, a novel about DevOps that was written by Gene Kim and George Spafford and Kevin Beer, which is really a seminal text about this subject and helps us understand a lot about technical debt and flow and the theory of constraints. Thirdly, we're going to talk about failure, a very important concept when it comes to DevOps and how to do failure smartly. And fourthly, we're going to talk about looking outside in, so really understanding how to run an IT development project from a point of view about what's really important to your end user. And finally, we're going to talk about measuring feature value, so how to understand what the ROI is of everything that you're doing in your IT development project. So firstly, let's talk a little bit more about releasing on demand. So I've been involved with customers trying to implement application release automation systems for about 4 or 5 years now. And what we've discovered is that where this kind of software has really come from is there used to be sort of 1 or 2 people in the IT operations department who had responsibility for building a server, and it's something that was a very manual task for them, took quite a long time, was quite onerous, quite repetitive, and quite boring. So these people, who are obviously very talented IT professionals, would get quite bored of this project and they'd start to develop the odd script. They'd go off, I've been doing that task over and over, I'll just write a script for that. And then they'd write another script and more scripts. And what you can see here on the slide that I'm now showing is our maturity matrix that we use for this part of the IT development process. So people kind of create more and more of these scripts, and then they end up often with something that I call a script monster. And these things can work. And I've worked with US pharmaceutical companies that are deploying thousands of MQ servers using scripts, doing a major upgrade of IBM's MQ series, for example, and knowing that it will probably work with the scripts, but also knowing that they're putting themselves at a lot of risk because the scripts are quite unpredictable. They're very difficult to troubleshoot, and there's usually a very limited amount of people in the organisation that actually understand them, usually the people that have just built them. And this is quite an important concept in DevOps as well, and if and when you've read or you read the Phoenix Project, you'll know that there's a character called Brent in the Phoenix Project. And Brent is very much a hero in the book because he has a lot of knowledge and a lot of capability in the organisation, but unfortunately this also makes Brent a bit of a bottleneck because he's often the only person that can answer specific questions that need to be resolved. So when we're trying to do release and deployment, we used to have lots of conversations with people about how often are you releasing at the moment, and they might say something like 2 to 4 times a month, and we'd say, would it be great if you could do that 2 to 4 times a week? But actually what we're really talking about now is the ability to release when that code is ready. So when we're doing things like continuous delivery, we're creating an environment where software is always ready to release, and what we're doing with release automation is creating a system where we can automatically release that feature or that iteration when it becomes available through its testing phases. We talk a lot about things like one button or push button deployments. So I've worked with UK governmental organisations in the UK who have outsourced some of their release process to an SI, and when it came to time to make a release, often the particular individual in the system integrator would be given a document of 140 pages long on how to build an IBM Web Application Server. and they would work through that, and they'd make the odd error, and the release would be a disaster. So another thing these sort of tools are trying to do for organisations is make it possible for more than one person to perform a release and make that release very predictable. So there's a couple of things that you would expect to see in a release automation tool. One would be the secure role-based access, and the other would be the ability to template a release. So the secure role-based access means that you can give lots of people access to specific areas of the release, whether that's you can only release into test, or they can release into production but only into this project. And the other part of that, so the templated piece, means that you can pre-build a lot of these server deployments, which means that people aren't having to sit around and perform really onerous tasks trying to build these things. So I wanted to show you this, which is from one of the banks that I've worked with, and this is really just trying to explain the difference between a release and a deployment. So even though Gartner were the people that coined the term application release automation, and that's something that's fairly widely used actually. So if you look at, for example, CA or BMC's release automation tool, they both carry the acronym ARA in their names. If you look at IBM's tool in this area, Urban Code, it has two different flavors, IBM Urban Code Release and IBM Urban Code Deploy. So what we're really seeing here across these kind of 24 items in the list is the ones up until the green bit are the release items. So these are more like process requests and bars that have to be stepped through. These are the kind of things that sometimes people try and do in Snow or ServiceNow, and these are really some of the kind of operational NFR type functions. And then secondly, kind of from the green bit onwards, we're starting, well actually from line 12, we're starting to get into the actual physical deployment of the tool, which is the automated deployment part of the operation here. So in summary, for this kind of first high-level DevOps goal, what we're trying to do is create an environment where an organisation can release on demand. So a good example of one of our customers that recently did this, Hiscox, and you can find their case studies again on our blog. Hiscox consolidated some of their core platforms. They had a multitude of platforms, which they got down to 2, and while they were in flight doing that, they implemented DevOps environments. They did some organisational change and implemented some orchestration tools around things like, well, they implemented Jenkins and Puppet and Urban Code. And in their first week of go live in the new system, they actually did 19 releases, which is considerably more than they'd ever done. And they were able to do that because they were confident that they had consistency of each of those deployments, and they were going through all of their gates all the way through from development through testing and into production. The other thing that this really gives us, and I've talked about ITIL and compliance already, or the ability to have controls around these kind of things. We've got these secured front ends, so what happens when anybody does anything in the system is that it's recorded in the system. So when an auditor comes along, you've got a full audit trail of everything that happens or has happened in that system, and this can enable you to do some really clever things. So again, another one of the banks that I've worked with in the past, when they had an auditor came in and said that they wanted to see what a system, a certain web page looked like on a certain day, they were able to tell them, and they were able actually to redeploy what that website looked on that specific day and actually show the auditor, not just tell them, but show them exactly what that website looked on that specific day. So let's talk a little bit about the second goal, which is about eliminating technical debt and unplanned work. So here we're talking about unplanned work, something that's very much covered in the Phoenix project. So the Phoenix project is very much about the theory of constraints and bottlenecks, but unplanned work is a thing that messes everything up, because we try and plan as well as we can do and try and say, right, this is what the projects we want to do, this is the resources we're going to apply to them, and these are going to be the budgets and the timescales that we're going to apply to them. And everyone knows that in IT, for quite a while, we haven't had a great record of delivering projects in time and budget, and this is one of the really big reasons why. So unplanned work is basically what happens when a system comes down or when a bug is identified, and suddenly that new development work or that testing of that new system has to stop while we fix that thing that's just been broken. And the biggest cause of unplanned work is around technical debt. So technical debt is when we try and code something and we make compromises or we make shortcuts in the code, which compromises the design. We may not properly consider dependencies, and we end up with problems in production. So there's a couple of things to note here, and one is, again, I mentioned CAMS earlier, and CAMS is an acronym that John Willis coined as a definition of what DevOps is really about, and it stands for culture, automation, metrics, and sharing. And some people, it was just Humble first did it, some people pop an L in there as well for lean, so it becomes CALMS. But the M part of CAMS is around metrics, which is a really essential part of what we do when we do DevOps. So the first thing that we need to do when we're trying to understand unplanned work and therefore reduce it or eliminate it is how much unplanned work we do. And surprisingly few companies actually measure their unplanned work today. It's not a particularly difficult thing to do, as most IT organisations run timesheets so that they can report on project success and resource utilisation anyway. So it really just requires putting in a time code for unplanned work and maybe another one for refactoring code. And then you start to get a baseline of how much time you're spending on unplanned work, and then you can start formulating strategies and testing out ideas for trying to reduce it. But the biggest way to get rid of technical debt or the unplanned work that becomes a consequence of it is to build quality into code early on. So this means using things like automated testing and doing things like understanding requirements very well up front. So we talk about shifting left a lot when we're talking about DevOps, and we talk about it in a couple of different contexts. So the first context really is about testing earlier, so that we know that defects are a lot quicker and cheaper to resolve the earlier on they're done in a development cycle. So we shift left in that way by automating testing, doing testing earlier. We also know things like if we can do things like involve operations earlier, we can ensure that that code goes through the release process faster. So that conflict that I mentioned earlier about development complaining that operations are not quick enough to spin up an environment, what actually often happens there is that operations get asked to provide an environment like now, and it's the first they've heard of it, and they need some warning, and actually operations are quite busy, either doing business as usual or quite often some unplanned work, and that puts a delay into the process, and the development team feel that operations are like a bottleneck, where the reality is that operations haven't had visibility early enough. So another way that we talk about shifting left is about involving operations early on in the process so that they understand what's coming through the pipeline, so that they can do things like include their non-functional requirements early on in the design process. And the requirements part of this is really important to mention here as well. So when we talk about building quality in, when we talk to customers who quite often come to us and say, you know, we've got loads and loads of defects, we think we need some automated testing to help us to get through these defects faster, we quite often encourage them to take a step back and do a full process review. And when we do that, we often find that actually requirements aren't being defined very well up front. So things that are being reported as defects and going through a defect or a change resolution or fix process are actually things that were poorly defined defects in the first place. So let's have a look at this here. So when we talk about automated testing, there's a lot of automated testing tools have been around for quite a while. So we've got kind of load testing and performance testing, and who's done that for quite a while. We've also got things like service virtualization. So when I was talking about these very complex environments that evolved over several decades, that have probably done things like SOA, and they've got lots of integrations to third parties and even to their own systems. A lot of the newer testing tools that we're seeing being adopted at the moment are around service virtualization. So creating a testing environment that is production-like and makes lots of calls out to lots of third-party services, or in the case of one retailer that we've been working with who has built their own website from scratch that interfaces into their IBM mainframe, they want to be able to test that website end to end without actually without actually making the calls to the mainframe. Similarly, some other credit card banks that we work with want to be able to test their process without having to build the environment to call out to credit check agencies, the likes of Experian and things like that. In banking, we see a lot of things, a lot of applications that want to try and avoid making lots of Swift calls and stuff like that. So service virtualization, this particular case study here is from another bank, and what you can see here is that by virtualizing the services in the testing environment and implementing Agile development, they were able to massively increase the volume of projects that they were getting through, whilst decreasing the cost of those projects by quite some significance. And in fact, this reflects more and more how our return on investment or investment cases are going with our customers. So typically we always used to write return on investment cases about productivity savings. Now we're writing more and more investment cases about being able to improve pace of change, being able to get more innovation to the market, and being able to earn more from the particular features that are being delivered to the end user. And we'll come back to both of those last 2 points in a moment. So the third high-level goal that I mentioned that I wanted to delve a little bit deeper into today is around failing safe or smart or fast, or indeed all three of those things. So failure is something that we often talk about when we talk about DevOps culture. So we have this phrase that we use a lot, which we talk about customers that are constantly dancing around the edge of failure, which sounds like a really dangerous and risky place to be. But I like to think of it more that you're kind of dancing joyfully around failure and perhaps teasing failure a little bit because you're not scared of it. And really what we're trying to say here in terms of DevOps is that DevOps is about innovation, but to be able to innovate really hard, so to be able to innovate at your absolute optimum level, you have to push boundaries, you have to be willing and able to make mistakes, and you have to be prepared for things to go wrong. And this is, you know, I guess one of the areas where DevOps sometimes gets itself a bad name, where people think that DevOps is very fly by the seat of its pants. And I think this is where we really need to understand that it's not about that, because what we're doing when we're doing DevOps is creating environments that are really, really safe, where people can experiment, where people can not be fearful about things going wrong. So it's not just about being a culture where people don't get told off or punished when they break everything, but actually creating an environment where it's very difficult to break something, or preferably and very easy to fix something when it's broken. So first of all, we need all of these controls through the software manufacturing pipeline, so all of the testing gates, all of the automated testing to make it easy for that feature to get through and be validated as good. Then we need to be able to have a system that tells us if something's going wrong. So this concept of preemptive failure. So a system, and again, coming back to my third point earlier that I was making about what makes DevOps different, this new generation of tooling around application performance management. So the ability to preempt failure, be able to give somebody a warning that a system is having a performance issue, looks like it's slowing down, looks like it's going to come down, and being able to alert them very accurately around that. So we have a lot of customers have a lot of monitoring systems. I'm sure everyone on the call has got at least 2 or 3 monitoring systems doing various things, probably across networks and servers. We have customers that are getting, sometimes I've had people tell me they've received 300 alerts in one day from the systems, and it turns into something that we call alert apathy, because then the alerts start to become meaningless. So we need systems that can really tell us when that thing is going or has gone wrong. Even with all of the alerting systems or monitoring systems that some of our customers have today, sometimes the first time they hear about a serious system outages from their customers. And you know, when we really need to think about, and we'll get here in a minute on section 4, but we really need to think about our end user experience first. So the last thing we want to do is be forcing our customers to report outages to us. The other part I really wanted to talk about here is around blame. So I raise this quite a lot when I'm in crowds of people, and you're all on mute today, so I can't kind of do a quick poll, but I often ask how many people have got a war room, because most people do, and the very phrase war room doesn't seem particularly healthy to me. We really want to try and get away from these, you know, these environments where a system comes down, it's totally catastrophic, it can't be fixed. So the other thing that these application monitoring tools enable us to do is give some intelligence back to the development teams. So the operations teams can say, oh, we've got a problem in production, it's there, let's give it to this team, and they can fix it. And the other part, or the other way that operations teams can really help with this kind of getting innovation to market fast but not being scared of failure piece, is by being able to recover really, really quickly. So there's kind of two elements of recovery. One I've just described in terms of being able to deliver an actual fix and by having intelligence around what the problem is. And the other one is about being able to redeploy or roll back to a last known good state very, very fast. And that's where ops really come in to the play there. So I've mentioned that dynamics a few times, and I wanted to show you these couple of slides really to again underline my point about one of the things that makes DevOps different is actually the tooling. Even though DevOps is certainly not all about tooling, it's the new tooling that's become available that makes it easier for development operations to work together better. So you'll have noticed in the 2011 graph that I just showed that App Dynamics wasn't even on this, which is the magic quadrant from Gartner for application performance management. And you'll now see in 2012 that it's popped up there, and you'll now see that in the 2013 quadrant it moved forward. So, you know, just to underline my point, this is where these technologies have come from very, very quickly and are doing things in new ways. So the really big difference about tools like App Dynamics is that they measure performance at the business transaction level. And I'll come on to that again when we get to point 4 and we start talking about looking outside in. But just to finish off these first 3 points, when we're creating a DevOps continuous delivery pipeline and tool chain with our customers, what we do is we create an environment where they can deploy at any time. So this concept of deploying on demand, so my first point, at very high speed, so we can automate through these gates, through the route to live, but they get preempted or preemptive alerts in production if there is any kind of issue happening or whether there's an outage happening. And they have the ability to instantly redeploy the last known working version and then push back with this intelligence back into the development team who can fix the problem and then push back through into the route to live. And the 3 tools that I kind of mentioned there, so application release automation and the service virtualization and automated testing pieces and the new world of application performance monitoring, all of those tools are relatively new tool areas and are very DevOpsy. So the 4th goal that I really wanted to cover on was about looking outside in. So, you know, this is something lots of customers have tried to do for a very long time. Lots of organizations have tried to do it. I think we talk a lot when we're talking about cultural change about things that are hard to do. We talk about change being really hard to do, although I have to say that I also think that change is quite constant, but there's certainly always pockets of people that are kind of resistant to doing stuff, and they're quite set in their ways. We talk about these habits that form in large organisations. It's quite difficult to see a new way of doing things, and it's quite difficult if you're, particularly I think if you're going to the same office with pretty much the same group of people every day and you're doing your job, and your job might be quite abstracted from the end user. It's quite difficult to imagine what's going on with them. But as our organisations have digitised and as our digital applications and our interfaces have become essential to our ability to thrive or even survive, it's essential that we all try and understand what our end user experience looks like. So here I'm showing you an App Dynamics screen, and what you can see is the network response time by location across mobile networks, across various different applications and across various different mobile OSs. So some of the end user monitoring you can do. Here again, we're having a look at what response times are looking at in certain through certain iOS mobile different versions and through different browser versions and browser versions on the desktops and the laptops and the iPads through different tablets. And here we're looking at crashes by connection type. And the other kind of thing that App Dynamics can do is, as I mentioned earlier, it really is it's a business transaction monitor. So it can tell you things like that particular point of your process of applying for, say, a credit card. Those particular bits of your process are taking much longer than they ever have before, so let's alert you on that bit. Or we can say, these particular users in this area are dropping out of the shopping cart when they're buying this type of products. There's all sorts of different insights that you can get into your system. And I think when we're talking about end user monitoring, there's a couple of other things that are worth talking about. I think we should talk about A/B testing and sentiment analysis, and probably some cognitive computing there as well. A/B testing, you could do things like send out a couple of different emails on the same subject but with slightly different text formats and see which ones you get a better click through and click on rate. You can do things like, at a very simplest level, have different buttons on a website with different with different colours, for example, and see which colour is more appealing to people. But when we're starting to develop in an agile method and we're developing iteratively, we could be delivering two similar features to an application, whether it be a mobile or a web application, side by side or very close, and being able to monitor how those features are being received is very, very useful. From a sentiment analysis point of view, we can automate a lot of this now. There are tools in cognitive computing and other tools where we can feed various different sources of sentiment from various different social platforms, such as, of course, Twitter and Facebook, and start making decisions based on what we're learning about that. So again, we could do it, and we'll come onto this again in a moment, but at a feature level, understanding what the impact of the feature is. But we can also do things like start to better service our customers. So I mentioned insurers earlier on who are perhaps being threatened by traditional retailers getting in on their patch and selling insurance direct. One of the advantages that retailers have over traditional insurers is a real deep understanding and lots of data collected about a customer profile. So one way that insurers could try and collect more data themselves is perhaps by starting to look at sentiment analysis and starting to look at social media feeds in a bit more detail. And this is also where we're starting to talk to people about cognitive computing, so things like IBM's Watson's analytics and Explorer solutions. So trying to take the structured and unstructured data that they have in their business and analyze it and mine it in different ways and gain different insights from it. So the fifth and final DevOps goal that I wanted to cover off was around measuring feature value. So I've touched on it a couple of times already, because it's about having this end user focus, or it's really a combination about having end user focus and also being able to do things iteratively. So in the past, when we planned to do a big software development, we put hundreds of features in there. It would take us months, if not years, and we'd deliver this thing in this big bang approach. It'd be really, really painful for everyone to get up to speed with all of the changes. It'd be very difficult to really track the ROI of whether all that investment was worthwhile. The more iterative we are and the more integrated we are across the whole process, i.e. the more we're able to track a feature from the requirement solicitation all the way through testing, so all the way through its journey into the production environment, and assign cost and resources and know how many times we had to perhaps refactor or redeploy that particular feature. Once it hits live, we should, if we have the right monitoring tooling in place, be able to measure the impact of that feature on our end user experience and therefore the value to our business. So I've touched on requirements management quite a lot, and this is the maturity matrix that we use, and this is really making the point that requirements is a really big part of DevOps. And I think when I look at things, and it's not included in this presentation, but if anyone wants to have a look at it, just email us afterwards, there's the Gartner Continuous Delivery Maturity Matrix, which doesn't actually include requirements management. It starts at build. But as I said earlier, we see a lot of customers who say, we've got lots of defects, and actually they turn out to be in requirements. So we see this in most places we go to, and we see most organisations are not really yet integrating requirements through the whole process. So we've got lots of organisations that are still using Word and Excel and potentially something like SharePoint or other portals, but really fully integrating that requirement from the start all the way to value is not commonly seen as yet. So to wrap up, I just wanted to make a few points. This is 2014's State of DevOps report from Puppet, and with inputs from Gene Kim and Jez Humble. I think hopefully we'll be seeing the 2015 one in not too long. When we first read this report, we were very impressed with it, obviously, but we also were quite pleased that it reflected what we were seeing in our market with our customers. So you'll remember when I talked about creating this environment when you're doing DevOps that enables you to release on demand, enables you to preempt failure, and enables you to redeploy through your automated testing gates and redeploy the last known good state instantly. This is really what was reflected in the State of DevOps report. So the key bit from this slide is really about turning deployment into a non-event that can be performed on demand. And in fact, we had some conversations on Friday with a number of people at an event that we held, and we were talking about this and talking about how a release should be like breathing. So and so I mentioned it very early on when I started talking about release on demand, this concept of a release weekend where everything stops and everyone has to come at work at the weekend, and it's incredibly tense, and there's pizza and there's Red Bull and things go wrong and everyone goes home exhausted on a Sunday. We shouldn't have to do release weekends. We should just be able to release like we're breathing. We shouldn't be holding our breath. It should be just you take a breath in, you take a breath out. And the way that you do that in DevOps is by doing it iteratively and making these small releases and putting these controls around you that give you confidence that what you're doing has some consistency and some predictability. The other analogy by the way, was driving on snow. So again, for us in the UK, we see snow. Well, seems to be about once every 3 years at the moment, but our country absolutely grinds to a halt. And if you do get caught out in your car in the snow, it's a very, very tense and unpredictable experience. And that's absolutely not what releasing should be like. It should be much more like the experience that I described last year when I went to Iceland for the weekend in February, and the lovely pilots on WoW Air announced to us as we were starting our descent that there was a blizzard on the ground in Reykjavik. But hopefully they said everything will be okay, and I realised with hindsight after we'd landed that they had been taking the proverbial out of us on board, because of course they'd done that 1,000 times and knew that they had nothing to worry about. This was the second high-level practice that's correlated with the success in or the most productive IT departments, which is around automated testing. So just to reiterate the points that I made earlier, if we want to give operations the confidence that the code we're giving them is good and they can be confident about putting it into live, then we need to do extensive testing. Testing is onerous, repetitive, and anything that is onerous and repetitive is usually pretty good to automate. The more challenging parts of testing around integration testing, there are now tools that have become available that make that much easier, make it much easier for the testing people to build environments or not even need to build an environment and can perform those tests automatically. And then the final State of DevOps report bit was around MTTR. So we've talked quite a bit about application performance management today and how that can help you preempt failure, and also give you the protections that you need to create an environment where you can embrace innovation without fear. So that was really these slides today. I'm just going to finish off with a DevOps toolchain diagram here, so the kind of components that we need to produce continuous delivery. And I will see now if we have any questions while we're looking at that slide.
So we only have one for now. If anyone has any other questions, please add them into the questions feature. But the question we have is, you mentioned culture a lot. How important would you say this is to DevOps transformations?
So culture really is the cornerstone of DevOps, and it's also one of the most difficult parts to identify, define, measure, or at least measure success or investment around and make happen. So in terms of culture, we know the kind of cultural attributes that we want to see in a DevOps culture. I mentioned a couple of them today, so the attitude to failure and also the attitude to blame, the ability to innovate, and there's some other things around sort of the way that ideas are presented and received and acted upon, and the way that structures or hierarchies are built. But in terms of making those changes, that's quite a difficult thing to do. And often when we're making change, or particularly around DevOps, we start by measuring things. And we can actually measure a current cultural state quite easily, basically by polling through an organisation around certain cultural attributes. But what we're trying to create when we create a DevOps culture is something that really embraces autonomy, mastery, and purpose are really the kind of the three key areas. And getting from where you are now to there takes a lot of kind of subtle changes. So organisational change is the big one that we normally start with people. So we do lots of things where instead of having an IT department where it's split into development and testing and BAs and DBAs and InfoSec and ops, is we try and actually reposition people around normally projects or products. That creates some challenges in itself. So once we kind of fragmented the testing team, for example, across multiple products, we lose some of the knowledge transfer benefits and we lose some of the standardization or commonality around tool sets. But there are ways to address that as well. But you know, there's nothing in life, unfortunately, if only it were, is perfect. But the more we understand by trying things, the more we can make improvements and identify best practices. So the culture part is essential. It is possible to measure. We know what we're aiming for in terms of autonomy, mastery and purpose. There's probably another point I should make there, in that the reason that culture and environment is so important is because that's how us humans are best rewarded at work, is by those intrinsic rewards. When we start trying to look at motivations, and in particular if we look at incentive programs within organisations, what we're often finding is that individual goals versus team goals versus organisational goals may also not always map. And we also find in our industry, the IT industry, which is a very knowledge-driven industry where we work on very complex, lengthy projects, what we find is that actually extrinsic or external rewards can sometimes be detrimental to driving people forward in the right way. So to summarise, Ted, sorry I rambled a bit there, culture is an essential part, and we've always talked about people, process, tools. Now we talk about culture, interactions and automation, but we do need to get the right people in the right place before we can look at each of these processes, streamline the processes, and we can't fully always implement a tool successfully without fully understanding the process. Vice versa, we often can't properly exploit a process without automating it.
Okay, we got another question, which is how much can you start DevOps as a grassroots initiative versus needing support from above the progress? From above to progress, sorry.
That's okay, I understood it. And this is a very common question about DevOps. And I think when we talk about DevOps transformation, we often put the number one thing in there is about having a mandate from executive management. But the reality is that DevOps was or is a grassroots movement. It started out as a Twitter hashtag, and in many, many organisations, if not most, we're seeing it as, again, a grassroots movement, that people in the IT department that are passionate and enthused about doing stuff better are making happen themselves. And what we're often seeing, particularly around tooling, actually, in the way that people are building or trying to build DevOps toolchains, is we see a lot of open source uptake. Basically because people don't have budgets, and this is the kind of second important point. It's kind of like, it's basically bottom up or top down, and the top down element is really essential to getting everyone on board, but also budgeting and making sure the investments are appropriate to results. So if you look at the Hiscox case study that I mentioned before, Gareth Walton, who's the CTO there, explains quite clearly how he had to get on board with the CIO there, and the CIO at Hiscox reports into the CFO, who reports into the board. But they kind of went through some grassroots change and tried a few things themselves, and then felt that they couldn't really proceed any further without having significant investment and understanding and the will to change across their organisation. And this kind of links back to the first question around culture, in that this will to change is really important. So if it is just a grassroots initiative and people are trying to do things on the back of a fag packet or a shoestring, and always with whatever software they can cobble together for free off the internet, does that really deliver on the promise that we think DevOps can? You know, we think DevOps is critical to an organisation's survival. We think, or we know, according to, if we look at the figures in the State of DevOps report, we know that people that do DevOps right have the best IT productivity and have the best performing businesses. So at some point, we need to develop that grassroots initiative into a mandated and board level supported project. I hope that answered your question. Please let me know if it didn't.
And there's another question. It says, your slide looks very waterfall. How do you make it faster, safer, collaborative, more than agile? Your last slide.
Yeah, that's the one we're on at the moment. And it's a really good point. And I've kind of struggled with this slide. Believe it or not, the previous version of this slide I had was even more waterfall, and it basically had kind of each of the toolings in the different areas. I think probably what I need to do to the slide, and apologies for not getting it done today, is probably I need to show the feedback loops in there. So I didn't actually end up talking about this much earlier, but when we were talking about unplanned work and technical debt, quite often I get a bit more caught up in talking about the theory of constraints in the 3 ways, and talking about identifying feedback loops and amplifying feedback loops. And what I tried to show in this slide compared to my original version is that you know, some of these requirements management people have often thought of something that happens at the design and planning phase, but actually it goes through the whole SDLC. But as you've noted and I described earlier, actually it's a constant feedback. You know, when that requirement went into production, how much was it worth? And then back, you know, what requirement do we want next, and how is that requirement important? How did it score in its original investment? So so yes, thank you for that comment, and next time I put this slide up I will make sure it reflects correctly how these all have feedback loops across the process.
Okay, next one would be, you touched on requirement management. This is something I indeed struggled with where I worked to introduce a DevOps culture. Can you give me examples of organizational matrices and integration of DevOps requirements in the Agile iterations?
Yeah, I haven't got an organizational matrix to hand at the moment, but let me just talk about some of the challenges that I see in some of my customers. So I mentioned this common kind of organizational change that I've seen happen, and this may be what you're touching on. So a lot of organizations have this concept of product owner. So when we reorganize the IT department around product, what often happens is hierarchically that product owner is seen as the customer and the owner of requirements. But what often happens is, and I mentioned the one problem earlier about kind of the knowledge not necessarily being transferred across the people of common discipline, and the lack of standardization or commonality across the tool sets once these kind of vertical teams are split up. The other thing that I've seen quite a lot is that when the product owner is seen as the customer, everyone else in the team loses sight of who the end user is, which is a little bit dangerous. And quite often these product owners don't have a technical background. And I see this in not just organisations that are not traditionally IT, but there's a particular organisation that we work with that basically specialises in retail data. So to all intents and purposes, they are an IT organisation, but their product owners have never been involved in the software development lifecycle and don't fully understand iterative development. So even though they've got all their team around them that are really keen and trained and struggling and wanting to do Agile development, they're still being given big long requirements lists and still being pushed to do effectively waterfall development. So there's kind of one stopgap solution that I've seen, which I think isn't probably the right solution, but it's where the IT team continues to iteratively develop, but the iterations aren't released. So you do get some of the benefits of Agile in that the iterations are short, but you don't get the benefit to the end user of getting a steady drip feed of features, and you certainly can't do things like measure the impact effectively of individual features. But where this really gets resolved is when we manage to incorporate the product owner into the IT process, so where we can do things like get them to understand how the team works and how iterative development works and why it works that way. And the two things that we've done that really help those product owners get on board with that is, one is something we do which is a DevOps simulation. So it's effectively a game. We spend half a day in a room with various different people from the organisation, including the business people and the product owners, and basically go through a simulation software development process. And that really helps the product owners and those people in the organisation that have struggled to understand iterative development. And then the other thing is really about this kind of the fifth feature that I said. So the product owners are normally the interfaces into customers, which is why their teams see them as the customer. But if they can start seeing the business value results reported on an iterative basis, then they start really understanding the importance of doing that. So I'm not quite sure that was completely answering your question, but perhaps you can drop another thing in the box if not, or we can catch up separately afterwards.
Okay, and the next question is back to culture and organization. You mentioned the first job is to get the right people in the right place. How does DevOps change traditional roles needed in the team?
So I'm trying to think what the traditional roles are in the team and how it's changing them. So I think a lot of the mistakes that people make are to either try to hire DevOps people, and we see a lot of anti-patterns as well, where people try and reorganize teams by creating things like another DevOps team, and that does sometimes work as a migration phase. So there's some good videos actually from Johnny Waldridge, who's now at the Cambridge Actual company, but was at M&S, and he effectively created a DevOps team at M&S. And that DevOps team was like a tiger team that was trying to evangelize through the rest of the teams the DevOps way, and that was partly about culture, so being more collaborative and being more communicative, and partly about trying to streamline the processes, so identifying bottlenecks and potentially using automation tooling in certain ways. So getting the right people in the right place is kind of less about roles in some respects and more about mindset. So you still need these roles, you still need testers. You're never going to do without testers. Maybe you need some less testers if you put some automated testing in, or maybe you'll be able to do more testing and increase your pace of change. But we don't suddenly not need InfoSec, and we don't suddenly not need development. I think it's more about getting people to understand and have empathy, and empathy. I think it was on Thursday, Tej, was it Justin Arbuckle or somebody was talking very much about empathy being at the core of everything DevOps is. So it's about getting everyone to be able to see and have visibility into each other's roles and being able to collaborate through the whole process. So not everyone can do everything. You can't kind of have a jack of all trades. So, there are most people that carry any kind of DevOps job title, and it's very arguable whether that is a real job title or not, have either gone from sysadmin to development and done both roles, or the other way. But really DevOps it's not about a role, it's about collaboration across the whole team. Hopefully that answered your question.
Okay, so we take one last question before we have to end because it's coming up to 3. It says, any advice on a process to capture significant changes in the service catalog?
I'm just trying to understand that question. I might have to speak to one of my colleagues about this one. So I think we're talking about ITSM type processes here. I'm not quite sure if you mean the kind of standard change process, or you're talking about changes in the ITSM process. Are you still there? I think it's Di that asked that question. Could you elaborate if you're still there for me? No, I'm going to have to get in touch with Di, I think, separately to fully understand that question, or maybe collaborate with some of my colleagues. But I think that was the last one. So sorry not be able to give you a full answer on that one, but thank you everyone for attending today. Thank you to Tejal and to Adele for setting this up, and thank you, Tej, for asking me those questions. And thank you for the team. And that's it for today. Goodbye.